America was founded on free thinking, on questioning authority, on refusing to blindly accept what a king or anyone told us was truth. That spirit of independence is in our DNA. And yet, I recently heard a scientist on the high wire say they don't go against consensus. Wait a second. How is that science and how is that thinking for yourself? When someone tells me to trust the science, I hear, don't think for yourself. Stop questioning. Hand over your freedom. That's just not who we are. Today, I want to show you how science was co-opted and how dogma replaced observation and why moms like me became called crunchy moms. Not because we wanted to rebel, but because we could see with our own eyes that the story didn't add up. In the early days of this country, thinking for yourself meant survival. Farmers tested soil, hunters read weather, families trusted what they could observe. Fast forward to today and we're told to ignore our senses. Don't listen to your hunger. Don't notice how you feel after eating. Don't question medicine. Just trust the science. But here's the problem. What people are told is science often isn't science at all. It's a headline funded by an industry wrapped in certainty that it never deserved. Take nutrition, for example. We were told fat makes you fat. Whole generations repeated this gospel. I have 9 and 10-year-olds in my cooking classes who believe this, who tell me fat makes you fat. When I ask them what fats are bad, they say saturated fats, not trans fats. Meanwhile, they're at home eating Cool Whip, which is tubs of trans fat. So apparently the marketing, the dogma, the propaganda of what is called science has worked. Let's go back to high school science class. Observation is part of the scientific process, and we've been told to stop observing. What? When did we stop believing our own eyes? We've watched our families get sicker on low-fat foods, for example, but we were told don't question it, just follow the guidelines. That isn't science, that's dogma. Well, now we know that we were fed lies with the margarine story, and we'll come back to that. Because here's a newer example of broken science. A single paper in a top journal became the foundation for Alzheimer's research, the theories, the drugs, and the funding for more than a decade. And now investigators have found that the images were manipulated, like they photoshopped the brain plaques. You've got to listen to Emily Kaplan describe it.
So you look at things like Dana-Farber, I'm in Boston, the preeminent Harvard teaching hospital here for cancer. They had 53 papers flagged for image manipulation. So this is another big problem. People are using Photoshop to change their images.
Wait, what would be an example of an image manipulation in a journal? Because this is different than a dating website where you're trying to make yourself look 40 instead of 53.
It's very similar. So I want my research to show these cancer cells have shrunk.
Oh my God. So you're saying you could go in with Photoshop or whatever and shrink the cancer cells?
Go through and look at all of these journals that have all these images, and they try to see which ones have been manipulated. Now, some of these you can see with the human eye. You don't need to have AI. But none of the peer reviewers are going through and looking at whether you use some tool to change your images. They're told to accept it, that the research was done properly. So there's no checkpoint for that. So with Dana-Farber, there were 53 papers flagged by this British guy who I've talked to. He did everything that you would think you should do, right? He contacted the authors, he contacted the hospital, he contacted the journals that they were published in, and nobody did anything. Nobody would respond to him. So he wrote a blog post, and that got the attention of the Harvard Crimson, which is the Harvard student newspaper. And so they started running stories on it. And then the mainstream media came in and became a little bit more interested in it. And Dana-Farber came out, and there's this guy who is the research integrity officer for Dana-Farber, comes out and he basically says, we take this very seriously. We're doing an investigation, but we don't know that there's any intent. So that caught my attention because as I used to cover murder for 2020 in prime time. And so I'm the intent is a criminal thing. It's not a scientific misconduct thing. And because our money is coming as taxpayers, is funding this, why don't we have some federal level of oversight when somebody claims that scientific misconduct has happened. And so I looked up with my team the research into, what does the statute say? And it's really clear. Like, it could just be negligence, which would mean that your name is on this paper and you didn't know what was happening in your lab. So intent has nothing to do with it. But by saying maybe this was an accident, most of the media just went away. We stayed on it and we kept asking them questions, and they won't even tell us if their investigation is ongoing.
Now read that again. Manipulated images, billions in funding, and it took years to retract. This isn't a blip. This is a system failure. When you see a headline that tells you proven, you need to ask proven where. If that can happen at top journals, what else got waved through? This is why moms like me stopped outsourcing our thinking. If the gold standard can be wrong that long, we have to go back to observation. What actually helps our kids in real life? Journalist Emily Kaplan has spent years uncovering what she calls broken science. And here's what she has found. She found cherry-picked data. Most nutrition studies are observational and people just fill out food questionnaires, and the researchers then try to link diet to disease. But correlation is not causation. We could take an example that ice cream sales increase in the summer and so do shark attacks, but that doesn't mean that ice cream causes shark attacks. Yet the headlines would treat weak correlations as fact. There's industry influence. In the 1960s, Harvard researchers were funded by the sugar industry, and they shifted blame for heart disease from sugar to fat. That single move shaped decades of food guidelines. Harvard School of Public Health even received early funding from Kellogg's. When industries pay, the outcomes tilt in their favor. Then we have media distortion. A small study might help, but the university press release says probably helps, and the next morning the Wall Street Journal proclaims proven to prevent disease. I mean, it seems like a bit of an exaggeration, but this is what is happening. We are getting guidelines without evidence. In 1977, the very first U.S. dietary guidelines were introduced. At the press conference, the authors admitted, "We haven't had time to do the science. This is political." Yet these guidelines became the food pyramid, which drove entire generations toward refined carbs and away from healthy fats. And we're seeing inertia in our standard of care. Doctors are bound by guidelines. Even when outcomes are poor, they prescribe the same drugs and diets. Most patients never hear the key question: does this treatment improve all-cause mortality? And do people actually live longer as a result? There's fraud and lack of accountability. And the result? A pipeline where weak or biased research becomes headlines, then guidelines, and then on our dinner plate. We don't need to wonder why our health has collapsed since the low-fat era. So-called science was left unchecked. Ever wonder why so many weak guidelines become ironclad rules? Well, here's the process. Authors pay to publish. Reviewers are unpaid colleagues. There's no fact checking of the raw data. And yes, there are literal paper mills adding names to work that wasn't even done. Here's Emily.
We have something now called paper mills, where there are papers being published that you basically are just paying to have your name added to. And sometimes the work has never even been done. Like, somebody tracked down some of these labs and found the labs don't even exist.
Give me an example.
So if anybody like Googles paper mills, you'll find it's a massive problem in academia. And part of the problem is that you don't get tenure as a professor unless you publish a lot. So there's all this pressure to publish. So people are going around and they're saying, okay, if you pay me $2,000, I'll add your name to this paper. We're pretty sure it's going to run in Nature.
No way.
I get 2 papers published in Nature, the likelihood that I get tenure is way higher.
Now let's connect the dots. A shaky paper at best becomes a punchy press release. This becomes breaking news, and that becomes a guideline that your pediatrician must follow. And now it's what your kid eats at school. And this is how we've normalized decline, which is why when people tell me we're healthy, I ask, compared to whom? Your grandparents or today's average? Crunchy moms didn't rebel against science. Crunchy moms are rebuilding it at home with observation and logic that actually works. Now, I can almost hear the objection, but we are healthy. So my daughter recently said her and her friends believe that they are all healthy, even though they were bottle fed and not breastfed. And I say, look at who you're comparing yourself to. When we say we're healthy, we have to first assess who are we comparing that to. Healthier than whom? Healthier than what? Because if we just zoom out, we can see the increase in chronic ailments. We have more kids with chronic disease than we've ever had before. And this is our new normal. Childhood obesity has tripled since the 1970s. Type 2 diabetes, once called adult onset, is now showing up in kids and teens. Kids are being put on inhalers, ADD, ADHD drugs, antidepressants. They have skin conditions, eczema, chronic fatigue, anxiety, food allergies. These were so rare a decade ago, and now they're just expected. So when someone says we're healthy, what they often mean is we're no sicker than the families around us. But if you compare to earlier decades, that's a very low bar. This is how broken science quietly has shifted culture. It redefines normal. And when everyone is a little worse off together, it feels ordinary. But moms notice. We see the decline in our kids with our own eyes. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. This is exactly why crunchy moms emerged. Crunchy moms trusted their own eyes over the headlines and started doing small, repeatable experiments at home, like swapping seed oils for butter, ditching the neon snacks and watching behavior, observing sleep changes. You know, that is science. When what is observed doesn't match the advice, that makes a mom question. You know, I wasn't a crunchy mom. I fed my kids out of boxes and drive-thrus. I bought low-fat everything. Remember Snackwells?
Attention shoppers! Reduced fat Snackwells cream sandwich cookies have just arrived in aisle 3. That's aisle 3.
Well, I was also a margarine mom. True story. At 18 years old, I had my first lipid panel run, and my triglycerides were over 300. I was part of an HMO at the time, and the doctor said, I really don't know what would cause this and what to tell you. And he brought 2 other doctors into the room. These 3 doctors stood there saying, your triglycerides should be less than 100. We do not understand why they're over 300. We feel that this is concerning, but we don't know what to tell you, except maybe don't eat fried foods. Now, a little backstory. When I was 10, my dad was diagnosed with heart disease. My mom was told to get rid of all fat in our house. She swapped the butter for margarine. We got rid of red meat, saturated fat. We could have as much pasta as we wanted. And being an Italian family, we ate a lot of pasta and bread. So I was raised on carbohydrates, lots of pasta, no fat. We went low fat, no fat, everything. And I bought into that hook, line, and sinker. I thought fat made me fat, and by going low fat would make me healthier and thinner. Well, we could see that at age 18, only 8 years after removing all fat, but still consuming all the carbs I wanted, that was not having a positive impact on my triglycerides. However, no one could figure that out, and it wasn't until my late 20s when I had chronic joint pain. At 26 years old, the pain in my ankles and my wrists was almost unbearable daily. I was told that I had carpal tunnel, and they were ready to do surgery on my wrists. But I kept asking, well, what about the pain in my ankles? And they said, well, there's nothing we can do for that, meaning there was no surgery for that. They told me the two were unrelated. The pain in my wrists was clearly carpal tunnel. The pain in my ankles, just take Advil. Had I started taking Advil 30 years ago, I would be in kidney failure or liver failure by now. The pain in my joints was from inflammation, from seed oils and carbohydrates, and I needed the saturated fats. I later went on antidepressants. This is the sign of a vegetarian diet, which at that point I was predominantly vegetarian and no fat. And that led to depression and mood swings, brain fog. You see, from the time that we were given that misinformation, and I started to follow all of the advice and the recommendations and the headlines, my health got increasingly worse. I recently had a conversation with Dr. Philip Oveda, America's Heart Doc, about this, and it's just sad when you know how much damage has been done to a whole generation by this profession. You know, one day I just couldn't ignore it anymore, and I had to take matters into my own hands, and that's really what led me on this journey to becoming a health coach. This, among other things that I have discovered over the last 17 years, was truly my wake-up call. I had clarity, and I did a 180. And yes, it looked weird. My kids really resisted at first because it was so different. But it was the only logical choice, and I'm a very logical person. Remember, I spent my career in network engineering. My brain is as left dominant as can be. Crunchy moms came from this gap between what was promised and what was lived. They trusted their own eyes. Kids hyper after neon-colored snacks, antibiotics after ear infections leading to more antibiotics, families following low-fat guidelines getting sicker and fatter, not healthier. These moms are not rejecting science. They're doing science, real science, and they're passing down what works. Isn't that what our grandmothers used to do? Now I can honestly say I will absolutely be a crunchy grandma because I've lived more, observed more, and I know that dogma is not our destiny. Our kids and our grandkids deserve freedom, the freedom to think, question, and choose what's real. Anyone who says trust the science has already stopped thinking for themselves. Science has become a religion to some who believe with blind faith, and I mean blind, because so much science hasn't reflected truth for a long time. Science is a process to observe, question, test, and replicate that is not limited to someone with a certain degree, a particular school, a title, or a profession. Those that refuse to outsource common sense got labeled. But thinking for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, is the most American thing that you can do. We don't need blind trust. We need curious families, kids who ask why, and parents who encourage curiosity. Grandmas, we need you to explain the difference between Cool Whip and real cream. And if you are hoodwinked by science, then wake up, grieve, repent, do whatever you feel called to do. But the world needs America to hold true to our founding principles, the ability to think for ourselves and be free. So if this video made you think, don't just keep it to yourself, share it with a family that you care about, because the world is watching. And what they need most isn't more slogans. It's parents who think for themselves and who teach their kids to do the same.